I went camping alone in the Qinling Mountains. The mountain does not like to be empty. I still remember the exact weight of my backpack when I stepped off the local bus. It was 40 pounds of gear, nylon fabric, lightweight aluminum poles, a portable stove, enough dehydrated rations to last 4 days in the deep valleys of the Qinling Mountains. I had planned this trip for 3 months. It was supposed to be a 2-man trek through the old, unmapped logging trails near the southern edge of Shanxi province. My friend Zhao Lin was supposed to be with me. We had bought identical gear. We had studied the satellite maps together during our lunch breaks at the office. But 3 hours before the bus left the city, his name popped up on my screen. The text message from Zhao Lin was brief. It read, "Something came up at the clinic. My uncle is very sick. I have to take the train back to the village tonight. I am sorry, you should still go. The weather is perfect." I stood by the side of the narrow asphalt road, watching the rusty exhaust of the bus disappear around a sharp bend. The air was thick and humid. It smelled of wet ferns and ancient limestone. I looked at the mountain ridge rising above the mist. It looked like a wall of green velvet. I did not want to turn back to the city. I had taken a full week of annual leave for this. I figured I could handle a well-marked trail on my own. I am an experienced hiker. I have spent nights alone in the forests of Yunnan. I adjusted the shoulder straps of my pack, turned away from the empty road, and walked into the tree line. The trail started out wide and clear. It followed the course of a small, shallow stream that bubbled over smooth gray stones. The sound of the water was comforting. It filled the silence of the valley. The canopy overhead was dense, blocking out the harsh afternoon sun, leaving the forest floor in a cool, emerald twilight. I walked for 2 hours, keeping a steady pace. My boots sank slightly into the rich, black soil. Everything felt completely normal. It felt like a standard weekend escape. The first thing that felt wrong was the silence. I noticed it when I stopped by a flat boulder to drink some water. The sound of the stream was still there, but nothing else was. In the middle of a Chinese summer, the mountain forest should be deafening. There should be the constant, irritating rattle of cicadas. There should be the sharp cries of mountain jays. But there was nothing. Not a single insect buzzed around my face. The air was entirely motionless. The leaves on the low bushes hung limp and still, as if they were made of plastic. The forest felt like a room that had been sealed for 100 years. I pulled out my phone to check my location. I opened the offline GPS mapping application we had downloaded. The blue dot representing my position was there, but it wasn't steady. It was twitching. It would sit still for 5 seconds, then suddenly jump 300 meters to the left, into the middle of a steep ravine where I clearly was not standing. Then it would snap back. I shook the phone, thinking the gyroscope was confused by the deep valley walls. The blue dot settled, but then it began to drift. It moved in a slow, perfect circle around the center of the screen, tracing a path that looked like a wheel. I closed the app and checked the network signal. There were no bars. That was expected. We were deep in the wilderness. But as I looked at the top corner of the screen, the little icon for the battery began to behave strangely. It showed 84%. Then it flicked to 85. Then 86. It was charging. The phone was resting in my bare palm, completely disconnected from any power source, but the little green lightning bolt was flashing on the screen. The battery percentage was rising by 1% every 10 seconds. It felt warm against my skin. A strange, unnatural heat that felt like a fever. I shoved the phone into my pocket and kept walking. I told myself it was an old battery glitch. I needed to find a flat spot to pitch my tent before the sun dropped below the western ridge. The mountains here lose their light quickly. Once the sun goes down, the valleys turn dark as ink in a matter of minutes. 20 minutes later, I found the first real sign of human presence. It wasn't a trail marker. It was a small stone structure built into the base of an ancient banyan tree. It was an earth god shrine, a 2D Miao. These small shrines are common in rural China, built to honor the local spirits of the land. This one was old. The stones were covered in thick, dark green moss. I leaned down to look inside the arched opening. There was no statue inside. Usually there is a small ceramic figure of an old, bearded man. Instead, there was a rough block of black river stone. The front of the stone had been scraped repeatedly with something sharp. Someone had gouged deep, vertical lines into the mineral. The markings formed a pattern that looked like a face with no eyes, just 5 long, jagged gashes where the features should be. Next to the stone sat a small, unglazed clay bowl. It wasn't empty. It was filled to the brim with raw, black rice. It smelled sour. It smelled like grain that had been left to rot in stagnant water. I stepped back from the shrine. My boot caught on a root and I stumbled slightly. A wave of sudden, irrational irritation washed over me. It was probably just the local villagers practicing some old, superstitious ritual. The mountain people in these remote corners of Shanxi still hold onto strange beliefs from the pre-modern eras. I looked at my watch. It was 5:30. The light was changing. The emerald twilight of the forest was shifting into a dull, smoky gray. I found a small clearing about 50 meters past the defaced shrine. It was a flat patch of high ground, raised above the damp soil of the stream bed. It looked like an ideal spot for a single tent. I unbuckled my pack and dropped it onto the grass. The sound of the heavy nylon hitting the earth felt loud, too loud. I set to work assembling the tent. I liked the routine of it. It gave my hands something mechanical to do. Click the aluminum poles together, slide them through the fabric sleeves, drive the metal stakes into the dirt. As I hammered the final stake with a flat stone, I noticed the texture of the ground. The soil in the clearing wasn't regular forest loam. It was loose, gray, and fine. It felt like ash. It didn't stick to my fingers like the black mud on the trail. It just fell away in a dry, silent powder. The tent was up. I crawled inside and rolled out my sleeping mat. The interior of the tent felt small and safe. The orange nylon walls gave the space a warm, familiar color. I decided to make a simple dinner. I reached into the side pocket of my backpack to grab my small plastic container of table salt. I wanted to season the dried noodles I had brought. The container was empty. I frowned. I distinctly remembered filling it to the top from the large bag in my kitchen the night before. The lid was screwed on tightly. It hadn't spilled inside the pocket. The fabric of the backpack was completely dry and free of white crystals. I turned the little plastic bottle upside down. A single gray grain of salt fell onto my palm. It wasn't white. It was dark, almost charcoal colored, and it felt greasy between my fingertips. I crawled to the entrance of the tent and unzipped the mesh door. The clearing was dark now. The trees stood like tall, thin shadows against the pale gray sky. I shone my headlamp across the grass, looking for any sign that I had dropped the salt while unpacking. The white beam of the LED cut through the mist that had begun to rise from the stream. About 3 feet from the tent door, the light caught something pale on the ground. I leaned out. Someone had poured a circle of white salt around my tent. It wasn't an accident. It was a perfect, clean line about 2 inches wide, but it wasn't a complete circle. There was a gap exactly 1 foot wide directly in front of my tent opening, and inside that gap, leading from the dark tree line toward my door, were 3 distinct impressions in the gray ash. They looked like footprints, but they weren't human. They were too narrow, too long. It looked as if someone had been walking on the tips of their toes, pressing deep, circular indentations into the soft earth. The last impression sat right at the edge of the unzipped nylon door. My pulse gave a sudden, sharp leap. I pulled myself back inside the tent and zipped both the mesh and the heavy outer flap completely shut. I locked the small plastic sliders together with a twist tie from my bread rations. My hands were cold. The air inside the tent had dropped 20 degrees in the span of 5 minutes. I could see my breath forming small, white clouds in the beam of my headlamp. I sat in the center of my sleeping mat, legs crossed, listening. The silence outside was absolute again. The sound of the stream seemed to have receded, muffled by the thick mist, until it sounded like it was miles away. My phone vibrated on the mat next to my knee. The sharp mechanical buzz made me jump. I snatched it up. The screen was incredibly bright, hurting my eyes. The battery indicator now read 100%. A new text message had appeared on the lock screen. It was from Zio Lin. The message read, "Do not answer if someone calls your name from the bushes. The old people in the village say the mountain does not like to be empty. If you hear me calling, it is not me. I am still at the train station in Xi'an." I stared at the text. The timestamp on the message said 6:15. I checked the current time at the top of my phone screen. It was only 5:45. The message had arrived 30 minutes before it was supposedly sent. I tried to type a reply. My fingers felt stiff and clumsy. I wrote, "Zio Lin, what are you talking about? There is something weird outside my tent. There is salt on the ground." I hit the send button. The phone didn't show a network error. It didn't say failed to send. The little text bubble just sat there, the words sending blinking rhythmically beneath the green box. It kept blinking over and over, a tiny green eye flashing in the dark. Then from the woods outside, I heard the voice. It was faint at first, a low, muffled sound that seemed to come from the direction of the stream. It sounded like someone calling out a name through a heavy blanket. I leaned forward, pressing my ear against the thin nylon wall of the tent. The voice grew clearer. It was Zio Lin's voice. It had his exact accent, his specific way of shortening the vowels at the end of a sentence. It was calling my name. He said, "Are you awake? I missed the train. I walked up the trail to find you. It is very cold out here. Let me in." The voice sounded perfectly natural, but the rhythm was wrong. There was a mechanical regularity to it. He would say the exact same words, then pause for exactly 4 seconds, then repeat them. "Are you awake? I missed the train. I walked up the trail to find you. It is very cold out here. Let me in." I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I remembered the text message on my screen. "If you hear me calling, it is not me." The voice outside wasn't coming from a person standing on 2 legs. It was moving slowly around the perimeter of my clearing. I could hear the soft, distinct crunch of the gray ash outside as something circled the tent. But the footsteps didn't sound like a man walking. They sounded like sticks poking into the dirt. A rapid, tripodal tapping sound that matched the 4-second gaps between the words. The tapping stopped directly behind my head, just inches away from the thin fabric of the tent wall. The voice spoke again, but it wasn't Zio Lin's voice anymore. It shifted in the middle of a syllable. It turned into my own voice. It used my own tone, my own specific way of breathing between sentences. It said, "Are you awake? I missed the train. I walked up the trail to find you. Let me in." The paranoia inside my head turned into a cold, blinding panic. I grabbed my heavy flashlight and aimed it at the fabric where the voice had been. The white light illuminated the orange nylon. There was no shadow of a head or shoulders. Instead, there were 3 thin, pointed outlines pressing into the fabric. They looked like long, skeletal fingers, stretching the nylon inward, trying to find a seam or a weakness in the stitch. I reached down and grabbed the crowbar I used for clearing trail brush. I held it against my chest like a weapon. I wanted to scream at whatever was outside to go away, but my throat was entirely dry. No sound came out. The text bubble on my phone screen suddenly changed. The blinking sending icon disappeared. It was replaced by a small gray word, "Delivered." Immediately after, a new message popped up from Zio Lin. It didn't come in a new bubble. It overrode the previous text. the letters rearranging themselves on the digital display right before my eyes. The screen read, "Why did you open the door? I can see you from the ridge. You are standing outside the tent. Why are you not wearing your shoes?" I looked down at my feet. My hiking boots were sitting neatly in the corner of the tent near the entrance. I was wearing thick wool socks. I was inside the tent. I had not opened the door. The twist tie was still wrapped tightly around the zipper sliders. I grabbed the phone and typed frantically. I wrote, "I am inside. I didn't open the door. There is something outside mimicking my voice. Help me." The message delivered instantly. Another text came back within 2 seconds. Zio Lin wrote, "Stop playing tricks. You just looked up at me. Your headlamp is turned on. You are standing in the middle of the clearing, but your neck looks too long. Why is your neck so long?" The phone dropped from my fingers onto the sleeping mat. The screen was glowing with an intense blue luminescence that seemed to fill the entire tent. The feverish heat of the metal device was so strong now that the plastic casing smelled like it was beginning to scorch. I looked toward the front entrance of the tent. The heavy fabric flap was vibrating. A fine, rapid tremor was running through the nylon, making a sound like dry paper rubbing together. The twist tie holding the zippers together was turning slowly, untwisting itself as if an invisible pair of fingers was working on the wire from the outside. I couldn't stay in the tent. It felt like a coffin. It felt like a small, orange trap that was about to be peeled open. I grabbed my backpack with my left hand and the crowbar with my right. I didn't bother with my boots. I didn't care about the cold or the rocks. I reached down, grabbed the zipper sliders after the wire fell away, and yanked them open with a single, violent motion. I burst out into the night. The mist outside was so thick I couldn't see my own knees. The white beam of my headlamp was useless, hitting the wall of white vapor and scattering the light into a blinding, featureless glare. The air smelled of wet copper and old earth. The silence had returned, heavy and suffocating. I didn't look back at the tent. I didn't look for the figure Zio Lin claimed he saw. I turned toward the direction of the trail and ran. The ground was ice cold against my wool socks. The gray ash squished between my toes like wet grease. I expected to hit the rocky bed of the stream within 10 steps, but the ground stayed flat, soft, and endless. I sprinted through the white dark, my breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps. My heart was beating so hard I could feel the pulse in the tips of my fingers. I ran for 5 minutes, then 10. The trail should have led me down toward the main road, but the forest never changed. The thin, black trunks of the trees appeared out of the mist like ribs, then vanished behind me as I passed. There was no sound of running water. There was no sign of the asphalt road. I stopped, leaning against a tree trunk to keep from falling. My chest burned. My feet were bleeding, the wool socks torn to shreds by hidden stones. I pulled out my phone again, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped it into the mist. The screen was completely white now. The icons for the network, the time, and the battery had all vanished. There was only a single text box in the center of the blank display. A message was typing itself out, character by character, as if someone was working on a keyboard on the other side of the glass. The text said, "Gui de Qiang, ghost hitting the wall. You are walking in a circle around the center of the world. You have been here for a very long time." I threw the phone against a rock. It didn't shatter. It hit the stone with a dull, heavy thud that sounded like leather hitting mud, and then the white light of the screen went out completely, leaving me in the absolute dark of the valley. The mist began to clear. It didn't lift like normal fog. It sank down into the earth, disappearing into the loose gray ash until the air was perfectly transparent. The moon was high above the ridges, full and bright, casting a harsh, silver light over the landscape. I looked around me. The trees were gone. The banyan tree, the bushes, the ferns, they had all disappeared. I was standing in a vast, circular depression in the center of the mountains. The ground was entirely flat, covered in millions of tons of the fine gray ash, and scattered across that gray plain as far as my eyes could see under the moonlight were tents. There were hundreds of them, identical orange nylon tents, all pitched neatly in perfect, concentric circles that stretched toward the dark mountain walls. Some of them were fresh and bright. Others were faded, rotting, their fabric hanging from aluminum frames like strips of dead skin. I walked slowly toward the nearest tent. My legs felt weak, numb with a deep, ancestral exhaustion. I reached out a trembling hand and unzipped the door. Inside the tent, a backpack sat on a sleeping mat. It was an identical model to mine, 40 pounds of gear, nylon fabric. I reached into the side pocket and pulled out a small plastic container of salt. It was full of white, pristine crystals. Next to the pack lay a wallet. I opened the wallet. I pulled out the national ID card. The photo on the card was mine. The name was mine. The home address was mine. But the date of birth listed on the plastic was 1932. My breath caught in my throat. A terrible, freezing clarity began to settle over my mind. The paranoia, the fear, the confusion, it all evaporated, leaving behind a vast, hollow space. I looked down at my hands. They weren't the hands of a 30-year-old office worker from the city. The skin was thin, spotted with age, the knuckles swollen and gnarled like old roots. The nails were long, yellow, and split at the edges. I reached up to touch my face. My fingers sank into deep, loose folds of wrinkled skin. My hair hung down over my shoulders in long, thin strands of silver. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I didn't throw it away. I hadn't thrown it against a rock. It was still in my jacket, right where I had put it when I left the bus. I pulled it out with my ancient, trembling fingers. The screen was working perfectly. The battery was at 12%. The network indicator showed no bars, but there was a thread of old text messages that had been saved in the memory of the device from before I entered the valley. I scrolled up to the very top of the conversation with Xiao Lin. I wanted to see the first message he had sent me 3 months ago when we started planning the trip. The text was dated June 14th, 2026. Xiao Lin wrote, "I am so glad you are finally taking a break from work. You have been so stressed since the anniversary. It has been 10 years since your grandfather went missing in the Qinling Mountains. Maybe finding his old campsite will help you find some closure." I stood alone under the silver moonlight, surrounded by the infinite circles of rotting orange nylon. The voice from the woods didn't call out my name again. It didn't need to. I opened my mouth, and the wet, chattering whistle of the mountain crow came out of my own dry throat, echoing across the empty plain of ash where I had finally found him.